Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to our ICS-EAIR forum. So we have the pleasure this time to have Professor Andrew Yeo to talk about the limits of hedging and South Korea's place in the Indo-Pacific. So Professor Andrew Yeo is Professor of Politics and Director of Asian Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. In addition to his most recent book, Asia's Regional Architecture, Alliances and Institutions in the Pacific Century, published by Stanford University Press in 2019. He's also the author and co-editor of 3 other books like North Korean Human Rights, Activist Alliances and Anti-US Based Protests, and also Living in an Age of Mistrust, and interdisciplinary study of declining trust in contemporary society and politics. So all of these are fascinating titles, and his research and teaching interests include international relations theory, East Asian regionalism, Asian security, South Korean societies, politics, and North Korea. So he's currently on a Fulbright senior scholarship in the Philippines, currently based in Manila, but going to return to Washington, D.C. very soon. He received his PhD in government from the Cornell University, and we are very delighted to have him interacting with our Malaysian audience this time. So Professor Kwek Cheng Chui would serve as the discussant after Professor Yeo deliver his talk. So now I would like to have Dr. Nyao Chaobing to introduce the funding of this project, which is from Korea Foundation, and a relevant project that sponsor this series of talks. Dr. Nyao, please. There might be some internet delay, and
good afternoon, Professor Andrew Yeo and everybody here with EAIR ICS. Sorry, the line may not be. Series of talk is sponsored by the Korea Foundation, which we are very grateful. This is a part of a grant that is been given by the Korean Foundation to look into the regional dynamics between China, South Korea, and ASEAN countries as well. So the talk will contribute to this academic activity. 5 seminars. Some of the past speakers, including Professor David Kang and Professor Bonnie Glaser and Maria Edric Carey and Karai and Professor Chong Jai-hon. If I remember correctly, I hope I didn't miss anyone here. So this is, I think, the 5th speaker on this series. And so that is the background of this series of talks. And we are very glad to listen to Professor Andrew Yeo today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Nyao. So we now will begin with the talk. So Andrew Yeo, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Hu Qiping and Dr. Nyao Chaobing. I want to thank the East Asia International Relations Caucus, as well as the Institute of China Studies and the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies for partnering together to host this event. We're also grateful to our friends at the Korea Foundation for sponsoring this intellectual forum, and to our global audience who are tuning in to listen. I'd like to mention that I am currently speaking from Manila, and I know Dr. Hu had mentioned that. So I'm here, I've been here since the beginning of the pandemic. However, as an American scholar based in Washington, D.C., but also ethnically Korean as a 2nd-generation Korean American, I sometimes wonder if my views on Asian security adopt an overly US-centric bent, or if I'm more sympathetic to South Korea than others. Of course, as scholars, we try to address intellectual puzzles and policy problems as objectively as possible. I mention my background, however, to emphasize how my own thinking has been informed by my experiences living and working inside the Washington Beltway, but also having spent significant time in Asia. I like to think that these vantage points have helped me assess regional problems with an eye towards thinking not only about the perspective of great powers, but also that of smaller actors. And by small powers or smaller actors, I don't mean this in a pejorative term, but smaller meaning anyone other than the great powers, in this case, US and China. So whether secondary or smaller powers seek to shape their own strategic environment is the wrong question to ask. Of course they do. The question we should be asking instead is, to what degree their own actions or agency enable them to peacefully coexist with larger powers, and how, despite their smaller size, they might be able to influence the future direction of East Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific. Whereas IR theories describing the last great power competition in the 20th century between the United States and Soviet Union afforded almost no agency to secondary or small powers, in the 21st century, IR theorists now recognize that some of the most interesting dynamics to unfold under great power competition revolves around the choices of small states. We have better analytical tools and concepts today to describe the type of interactions observed between small and great powers, which did not exist during the time of Kenneth Waltz at the height of neorealism. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn directly to the topic for today's lecture on the limits of hedging and South Korea's place in the Indo-Pacific. For the past 2 years, I've been conducting research on South Korea's new Southern policy and its relationship to the US-South Korea alliance and Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy. However, there's an entire literature on the topic of hedging, which I have not followed very closely. So in this regard, I'm using this lecture to probe new research ideas and also gain insights from Dr. Cheng-Tui Kwik, our discussant for today and one of the foremost experts on hedging in IR. Cheng-Tui and I have exchanged several emails over the past week to discuss hedging in Asia, so I'm very much looking forward to continuing our exchange at this forum. Incidentally, the topic of hedging was discussed in a prior EAIR caucus lecture held earlier this year with Professor David Kang, who's a good friend and a role model of mine. Professor Kang has long argued that East Asian states are neither balancing nor bandwagoning between the US and China. In that lecture, Professor Kang explained why South Korea avoids choosing sides between the US and China. Korea wants to maintain positive relations with both countries. Seoul does not want to choose between Washington and Beijing, but it prefers to stay in the middle. For Professor Kang, staying in the middle, or hedging, is the status quo position. More notably, South Korea and other regional actors are not necessarily distancing themselves from China. The Sino-Korea border is a reality and a fact for Koreans, whether from the north or south. Koreans must therefore learn to live together with its much bigger neighbor. What makes the Korean case so interesting is that South Korea has a very strong alliance with the United States. We might expect Southeast Asian nations to hedge between the US and China, as they have no formal alliance partnerships with the United States or China, with the exception of the Philippines, which is an unusual outlier under Duterte's rule, and maybe Thailand. But in the case of South Korea, there's a clear alliance commitment between Seoul and Washington through the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty. This is the reason why some Washington policymakers get annoyed when it looks as if South Korea remains less committed to US strategic objectives. We saw this in the mid-2010s when the Obama administration pushed to deploy the THAAD missile defense system on South Korean soil, which the Koreans had said no to for years, until Koreans became upset by China's slow response to North Korea's fourth nuclear test in 2016. More recently, ruminations about South Korea's absence from the Indo-Pacific narrative and the Quad has also raised questions in Washington about where South Korea stands as US-Sino competition heats up. Let me return to this topic of hedging and its place in international relations theory. I agree with others that regional actors do not want to choose sides when it comes to US-Sino rivalry. Small states therefore adopt a range of strategies between balancing and bandwagoning to navigate relations between Beijing and Washington. This can include soft balancing, accommodation, and non-alignment. It might entail a mix of policies meant to engage or constrain the behavior of great powers, or what Dr. Quick adeptly coined as limited deference and selective defiance. By the way, this terminology is also perfect for describing our kids' response to parental authority, limited deference and selective defiance. So I thought those were great terms applicable outside of IR. But although the international relations literature continues to emphasize the concepts of balancing and bandwagoning, we must remember that these are ideal types. In the real world, very few states, if any, purely balance against or bandwagon together or bandwagon towards a rising power or threat. In practice, states will rely on a variety of strategies short of balancing and bandwagoning to minimize risks. For these reasons, smaller states, again, and when I mean smaller states, I mean any countries that aren't great powers, might well be seen as hedging the United States and China. Adopting a middle position is a very natural response in the face of uncertainty. As in life, when faced with different choices which involve risk and uncertainty, most people will not place all their money or resources on a single option. Instead, we diversify risk by hedging our bets. And I had a few examples from boxing and poker, but I didn't want to give the audience the wrong impression of what my extracurricular activities are. So I'll just assume that we all understand what we mean by diversifying risk and hedging bets. But this is what we mean, this is what we see many smaller states in East Asia doing at this very moment. Hedging is a strategy to ensure one's own security and to mitigate the risk of entrapment and abandonment. As Dr. Quick has written, hedging is a self-help mechanism to respond to the uncertain actions on the part of the big powers. To offer a more formal definition, he mentions, hedging is insurance-seeking behavior under high stakes and high uncertainty conditions. It entails avoiding rigid alignment by insisting on not choosing sides. Two other scholars, Darren Lim and Zach Cooper, have defined hedging as an alignment choice involving the signaling of ambiguity over the extent of shared security interests with great powers. So I think we all get the basic idea of what hedging behavior looks like. The middle position may be the default or natural position for small powers. In the context of peace and stability, there's no reason why South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, or any other country in East Asia wouldn't try to maintain positive relations with great powers. In fact, states wouldn't need to hedge as there would be little risk. So again, the middle position in times of peace or stability is really the natural position for smaller powers. And that goes back to say that hedging is a response to risk rather than threat. And other scholars have argued this as well too. I think it was in the Lim and Cooper piece where they talk about the focus should be on risk rather than threat. Paradoxically, however, in international politics, when the system is on the verge of great power conflict, that is when risk is at its highest, or when risk is the greatest, hedging becomes much more difficult as great powers begin to put pressure on states to choose sides. Not choosing a side may result in backlash or punishment from great powers. Great powers from their vantage point do not like the uncertainty, so I say uncertainty that comes with hedging or non-alignment, even though ironically, it is the uncertainty within the system that drives small states to hedge in the first place. As such, the space for hedging becomes narrower as hedging itself takes on new risks. The risk of punishment from one or both great powers if hedging is bungled, and also the risk of getting caught in the middle if conflict actually erupts. So let me now turn to the context of South Korea, or look at South Korea's case in the Indo-Pacific. South Koreans do not typically describe their foreign policy strategy as one of hedging between the US and China. Instead, Korean policymakers, to the extent that they acknowledge hedging at all, see their role as one of a balancer. This is a term typically adopted by South Korean progressives. In the early 2000s, President Roh Moo-hyun sought greater autonomy from the US alliance and described South Korea as playing the role of balancer in Northeast Asia politics. And the Bush administration, this is the George W. Bush administration, who did not have a good rapport with the Roh government, was really unhappy about South Korea's self-described balancer role. The role of balancer was recently evoked by longtime advisor to progressive governments and South Korean IR scholar, Professor Jung-in Moon. The term balancer, as used by Korean officials, may be a bit confusing, especially to IR scholars, since South Koreans are not using this term in a true Waltzian sense. Rather, it implies South Korean autonomy and its willingness to lean towards different power or powers, so long as it enhances Northeast Asian stability and peace. And so the reason why this bothers US policymakers sometimes is it's as if South Korea is not really willing to commit. It wants to play this balancing role, to lean in one direction or the other to preserve stability and peace. Regardless of whether you call it balancing or hedging, South Korea since the 20th century has sought greater autonomy, or at least since the 20th century has sought greater autonomy. I mean, Professor Kang will tell me that it's for hundreds of years. But this, regardless of whether it's hundreds of years or since the late 19th, early 20th century, this balancing or hedging behavior is a manifestation of Korea's own tragic geopolitical history, being surrounded by great powers. Whether it's Russia, China, and Japan in the late 19th century, the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War, and now in the 21st century, US and China. It goes back to the Korea being the proverbial shrimp among whales, the expression that Koreans love to say that when the whale's tail goes down, all the shrimps get scattered and moved around. So this desire for autonomy tends to be more pronounced, as I've argued, under progressive governments, including the current Moon government. The Moon government's early reluctance to embrace the Indo-Pacific strategy illustrates South Korea's preference for autonomy. South Korea does not want to be seen as part of an anti-China coalition. At the same time, I don't want to mischaracterize the Moon government's foreign policy strategy. Let me be very clear here. US-South Korea relations have been robust, and Moon Jae-in, unlike his mentor and progressive predecessor, Roh Moo-hyun, has done exceptionally well in maintaining close channels of communication and coordination with the United States, especially considering that his engagement with the US was mostly under an unpredictable Donald Trump. If there is any doubt about the US-South Korea alliance, reread the lengthy joint statement following the Moon-Biden summit a few weeks ago. It was probably one of the most detailed joint statements that we've seen in years for any alliance relationship. Of course, a strong alliance does not imply the absence of policy disagreements among allies. Also, South Korea has to contend with a China whose relative power will likely continue to rise. So it prefers not to rupture Sino-Korea relations, even if it means holding back on some US initiatives. South Korea will pursue the strategy it believes will best suit its national interest, and that means holding on to the US-South Korea alliance. But it also means ensuring that it can maintain diplomatic relations with Beijing. China is South Korea's largest trading partner. And more importantly for Korea, in the long term, China will play an important role in any future peace process in Northeast Asia, including potential reunification with North Korea. South Korea will need China's cooperation to achieve a peace regime. Unfortunately, it is becoming increasingly harder for South Korea to navigate between the US and China. As Korea watchers know, South Korea has received pressure from the US to engage with the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Seoul has worked quietly with Washington to find ways to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific area by agreeing to coordinate initiatives related to human capital development, capacity building, and investment that falls under the scope of the New Southern Policy and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. But as a core US ally, there's an expectation from Washington that Seoul will engage Quad countries more openly on the strategic and democratic front as well. Korea, understandably, does not want to upset China by going all in on the Quad. However, if South Korea remains disengaged from the broader strategic dialogue, there's a risk that it may remain marginalized and isolated from these strategic conversations. Autonomy may help South Korea in the short run and avoid Chinese economic or strategic coercion. But in the long run, decisions made by the Quad or China's reaction to Quad policies may also adversely impact South Korean national interests. Why? Because of the network nature of security, trade and finance, and technology. If hedging means avoiding criticism or not responding to repeated violations of international norms and law, then the ability for South Korea to shape its own strategic environment may further decrease. I don't know if this proposition has already been tested, but as rivalry intensifies between two great powers, it becomes increasingly difficult for smaller states to remain in the middle as they face pressure from both great powers. We may not necessarily see pure alignment or the formation of formal alliances, but states will begin to lean in one direction or the other. For these reasons, I predict, and I'm very wary of using the word prediction because political scientists are very bad with it, but I'm going to say here that I predict South Korea will align itself further to the United States in the upcoming years. We are already seeing the Moon government warming up to the Indo-Pacific language as it was evoked several times in the joint statement. It also appears that South Korea will continue to engage the Quad through the Quad Plus formation. Moreover, I was surprised to see the joint statement make reference to Taiwan, a first for US-South Korea joint statements. Of course, the joint statement stopped short of naming China directly when mentioning threats to a rules-based international order. And the US-Korea joint statement may have looked much softer on China when compared with the US-Japan joint statement, which was much more direct in calling out China as a threat. However, I believe we will continue to see greater cooperation between South Korea and the US and more multilateral engagement with other Quad countries in the future. There's flexibility in the Quad, and as of now, they are focused on addressing areas of common concern. Issues like climate change, COVID-19, or new and emerging technologies. It would be better for South Korea to pool its risk with other like-minded countries. And here, of course, like-minded means code for other US allies and partners. So Korea can pool its risk with other like-minded countries, even as it continues to maintain diplomatic relations with China. Conversely, however, the adoption of a more neutral position or hedging in the Indo-Pacific will not necessarily prevent China from undercutting Seoul's regional interests in the future. For instance, China's economic coercion leveraged against the third country may still indirectly impact Seoul. And there's no guarantee that deference to China will protect South Korea's own interests as it seeks to boost development aid and infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of areas where there could still be competition or conflict or tensions between Seoul and Beijing, even though Seoul remains deferential to Beijing. I actually think if China really, if China sets a goal and it seeks to do something, it's going to set out to do it, regardless of whether it hurts South Korea's interests or not. So let me just conclude by saying that there are limits to hedging when great power competition intensifies. Now, I just thought of this right before delivering or logging on to Zoom to deliver this lecture. I haven't read Thucydides recently, the Peloponnesian War, but if I remember this correctly, as smaller Greek these smaller Greek city-states, as they observed the growing rivalry between Athens and Sparta, they began choosing sides. The Melian dialogue, in fact, was Athens reasoning with the Melians that neutrality would be futile. Professor Kang would skewer me for bringing up this analogy because he finds it problematic and wrong to use Western history, ancient Western history at that, to describe processes in East Asia. He really hates this Thucydides exemplar analogy. But I do think it does serve my point that hedging will be more difficult for South Korea and other regional actors moving forward if US-Sino rivalry continues to heat up. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much. This is such an excellent talk. And now we will follow up with very sharp and on point discussion points from Associate Professor Dr. Kwit Cheng Chui. You have the screen now.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hu. And thank you also, Dr. Niao, for your kind arrangement. Good afternoon to everybody. Professor Andrew Yeo is one of the scholars whose scholarship, whose work I admire for a long time, but we have not got a chance to meet with each other until today. So even though on screen I'm kind of excited to hear his views, and I certainly learned a lot from his very comprehensive and also pointed observations, not just about South Korea's position between US and China, but also about hedging particularly. So I think given the time that I'm given, I thought what I would do in order to perform my task as a discussant, it's to share 3 points. 2 points are the issues that I thought Professor Yeo and I have kind of a mutual understanding. I think I agree with him on those 2 issues. And the third issue would be the issue which I thought perhaps we have different views or different takes, maybe primarily because of his views are reflective of, I would say, a US-centric position, which Professor Yeo acknowledged at the very beginning. And let me also review my own bias as a small state perspective. Certainly, I could not speak for all smaller countries, but I'm hoping to reflect small countries' views on certain issues that we do have a number of common denominators. All right. So let me begin with first 2 points before I elaborate the third point. The first point, which I thought is quite clear from Professor Andrew Yeo's presentation, is that hedging has limits. And in fact, this is the title of Professor Yeo's talk. So the limits of hedging. And I think this is something that writers on hedging, myself included, we all agree, we all acknowledge either explicitly or implicitly, meaning that the hedging, of course, has limits in the sense that it is not panacea. It's not something that we hope to settle everything. It is perfect. There is no such thing in empirical in the reality that we are living in. So hedging certainly has its own limitations. It solves some issues, it reduces some risks, but at the same time, it also exposes ourselves for other problems. And that's something that I think it's commonly shared, which I think I agree with Professor Yeo. And the second point related to the first point is that in addition or other than hedging has its limits, the second issue about hedging as a state approach is that hedging is also an ambiguous, it's a policy with ambiguities. It's ambivalent, it's ambiguous. And this is something that, again, I agree. And we can have a lot of examples. Professor Yo's excellent presentation used South Korea as an example to show how ambivalent and ambiguous South Korea's position has been, right? On the one hand, South Korea is a treaty ally of United States since 1950s until now. But on the other hand, you do see South Korea try to hedge its bets by keeping some distance from certain issues that US clearly has a strong position and strong opinion. For example, South China Sea, for example, Indo-Pacific, so on and so forth. And even on Taiwan, right? So those are the issues that clearly you do see some ambiguity on the part of South Korea as a smaller or weaker actor when faced between US and China. And let me use one more example this time around on Southeast Asia. And in fact, the timing of this talk, I thought, is fantastic in the sense that over the last 1 week, few weeks, we have seen a classic example of hedging on the part of Indonesia, the largest country in Southeast Asia. And as we talk, we know that just a few days ago, in fact, the last weekend, Luhut, as an envoy of President Jokowi, actually met with Wang Yi, and they had a bilateral talk at very high level. They had the co-chair inaugural dialogue mechanism, and I think that is a very high level, very unique dialogue, which I'm not quite sure whether other ASEAN countries actually fought with China. So anyhow, that was a very one indicator of Indonesia, despite all they have done on South China Sea, on Natuna, also try to collaborate something opposite, try to collaborate with China, and but at the same time signal some defiance to China, but only selectively. So that's the keywords, that you defer in a limited way, but at the same time you also defy in a limited and selective way. So Indonesia's case illustrates as much as that, because just 2 days after Luhut Wang Yi meeting, Retno, the Indonesian foreign minister, also met with Wang Yi, but at the multilateral ASEAN-China context on Monday in Chongqing. And that was a time that Indonesia made it a point to actually raise issues on South China Sea, despite the fact that we all know China did not happy about it. So this is a kind of a classic example of Indonesia's way of hedging by defer and defy to China at the same time, but only selectively. When I say selectively, is that at the same time, you also know that Indonesia actually avoided certain issues, like, for example, Xinjiang, despite the fact that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. But on Xinjiang issue, Indonesia under Jokowi clearly has decided that let's not antagonize, let's not defy China, and then Indonesia has been relatively quiet about this issue. And that's an example of a selective deference, while they selectively defy China on South China Sea. And you see that there is a series of military exercises conducted by Indonesian military, with Jokowi make the high-profile presence there. And at the same time, Indonesia also tried to defy China by forging and diversifying a lot of high-profile strategic defense partnership with countries like Japan, and of course, Australia and US, the long-standing partners. And what is interesting is that they have also done that with some new partners, for example, Germany and also France, and the list can go on. And again, Indonesia's case of hedging by limited defiance and also limited selective deference, it's not unique. It's shared by all other countries in Southeast Asia, except perhaps Myanmar after the coup, which they do not have the option. But this is something that my friend Andrea is very familiar with. I would leave the issue aside. So let me now, with the remaining time, quickly move on to the third point, which I thought maybe this is a big disagreement among scholars on this particular issue. And even though Professor Yora did not mention that, but I believe that we have a different take on this particular issue, which is that my view, my position is that despite the limitation of hedging, despite the risks surrounding the ambiguity of hedging, hedging is actually desirable. and it is counter hedging. It is a counter hedging that is a source of problem, source of instability, and is dangerous. I know this is counterintuitive because of most scholars would describe hedging as a source of instability because of it create speculation. And I hold exactly the different view, primarily because by hedging, small states try to not take sides so that we try to avoid regional polarization. We want to keep the options open, primarily because of we know that the source of assistance is not certain. And then also threat perception is not converged completely. What the country A or power A are concerned about might not necessarily shared by smaller countries. For example, now US make it very clear with all the new the policy with Biden continuing a lot of things that Trump started, and then actually is doing more. You do see some risks are being increased. Let me take an example of what I mean by counter hedging, and let me also emphasize that it's not just the US who is pursuing this. China is also pursuing a similar action of counter hedging. What do we mean by counter hedging? Is an action on the part of big powers, in this case, US and China, try to put pressure and more pressure on the part of smaller countries who are pursuing hedging by trying to stop them from hedging and align with them more closely, if not completely close. So the very example that Professor Yeo mentioned early on by referring to the recent summit between President Moon and Biden is a perfect example of counter hedging. US is trying to influence the decision of South Korea. No more hedging on South China Sea, on Indo-Pacific, and which is why those issues were included in the statement, joint statement. And Taiwan is another surprise. And those are the issues that South Korea has been keeping distance for a long time. But now it is being, from smaller countries' perspective, we see that South Korea is now being entrapped into a US policy of putting more pressure on China through Indo-Pacific, but also through Quad, through multilateral and also unilateral actions. And this is just a latest example. You could see something similar from Prime Minister Suga's summit with President Biden. Again, Taiwan issue, Hong Kong and all that was also included. So this is like a US way of counter hedging. China is doing something similar. I think it's a coincidence that Professor Yeo is in Manila. I think why China is, despite with all the 230 is a very accommodative policy, send 200 over ships to into Philippine water. And just a few days ago, Malaysia, a long-standing partner who has been very friendly to China, what happened? Sending 16 aircrafts to our airspace, trying to send a message to Kuala Lumpur, to Putrajaya, that stop hedging. We don't like, China does not like the way Malaysia continue to enhance and also partner with United States on the defense and also many other issues. So I think those actions, big power, counter hedging, and also trying to push one over the other and trapping and involving all other smaller countries are actually more dangerous than a small state hedging who is trying to preserve some maneuverability and also freedom of actions because of we are not interested to be entrapped by a big power conflict, something that Andrew mentioned, which I completely agree. And we are also do not want to be entrapped into the ideological based competition of big powers. So I think I would stop here. I think they perhaps already sparked a number of further issues, either for questions or perhaps from comments, further comments from Professor Yu. I will stop here. Back to you, Professor Hu.
Thank you so much. And I would like to have Professor Yeo to respond these three main discussion points as highlighted by Dr. Quick just now. So especially on the fact that the limitation of hedging itself is actually a form of counter hedging and can be the source of instability. So what is your immediate thought about that?
Sure. So thank you so much, Cheng Tui, for those insightful points. I'm glad that we at least agree on two of the three points there. And but even on the third, I guess it's not a complete disagreement. I wouldn't have called it counter hedging. I mean, I didn't know that that was a term. To me, it's just the U.S. and China are being bullies. They're pressuring or they're bullying the smaller countries to kind of bend towards their own preferred strategy. And I can see why that would be, why that might lead to a greater instability or a conflict. But to me, it's, I guess, going back to the previous point about hedging itself being a strategy that creates or enhances stability. That can be true, but there's an underlying assumption that the great powers understand what the smaller powers are doing. I mean, you might recognize it as hedging, but in some cases, the U.S. might see it as maybe China is trying to lure other countries. Maybe it's trying to lure or press Malaysia to shift, to shift towards closer towards Beijing, or maybe China sees the United States as really pressing the Moon government to join the Quad or do more on the Indo-Pacific and ultimately contain China. So on one hand, yes, these actions can then ratchet or spiral. So it's a classic. I'm blanking on the term, but it's not an arms race but it's more about this ratcheting effect where it spirals out of control. It's a security dilemma. Thank you. For an IR scholar, that should be at the tip of my tongue. But you're generating a security dilemma by relying on this counter hedging strategy. So I think that's why we see instability. So I don't necessarily disagree with that, but it's with the hedging itself. I feel like with great powers, so they, for them, their frame of reference really goes back to this idea of balancing. So they want to see a balanced, they either want to see primacy, so they want to have greater influence, or they want to make sure that the other side does not have leverage, a leverage over them, that they don't have, that they can't press the other side. So they want to see either a balanced situation or they want to see primacy, for lack of a better term. And I think that's why we see, great powers adopting what Cheng-Chi talks about as counter hedging, but it's where do you begin? Where do you begin to see instability? Because one could argue that, well, it's the hedging behavior that leads to the counter hedging, and so then that's what causes this instability. It's one of these problems where does the causal chain begin when you're trying to say what causes greater stability or instability? Whereas for me, I'm arguing that it might begin with hedging. Hedging leads to counter hedging, or hedging leads to balancing, because great powers react and then smaller powers react. For Cheng-Chi, his basis at the beginning is that the hedging strategy itself is a relatively benign strategy, because by definition, you don't want to pick sides. You want to avoid conflict, but you got to remember, small states are hedging for, they're just looking at their own narrow kind of national interest when they hedge. They don't think, with Malaysia hedges, it doesn't really think about South Korea, or, when South Korea hedges, it's not thinking about what Japan does. And so there's a possibility that if all these countries are hedging, there's going to be some kind of conflict, there's going to be some kind of miscalculation, misperception. So to me, that's what makes hedging strategies unstable. And so if you're a great power, your vantage point, yes, great powers are looking at their national interest, but when they look at the region, they're looking at how the confluence or the actions of all these other smaller powers add up to create a particular dynamic within this great power competition. So I think I got on for quite a bit, so I think I'll stop there. But yeah, I don't think we've necessarily resolved anything. But yes, I definitely see where Cheng-Chi is coming from with this idea about counter hedging creating instability.
So I'm actually quite curious to poke further because if you don't mind, because we still have like about 1 hour left. So I would like to invite Cheng Chui to respond about, I think there is a good rationale in trying to understand that whether it begin with the hedging itself may come with we may begin with a benign intention, but because of the big powers reaction to it, and therefore the ensuing counter hedging and the chain of reactions and whatnot, security dilemma. So it became destabilized somewhere along the process. And I would like to know your view about that. And how about the hedging strategy itself? I took interest when Andrew mentioned about when Malaysia hedge, we don't think about South Korea, but I think hedging in the way is to rely on as many partners as possible, diversifying our interests. So what is Cheng Chui's take on this?
All right, all these excellent points, and I like the way Chu Ping framed, and also the way Andrew actually responded and also elaborated because it's very spot on, very sharp. So let me begin with one of Andrew's last points, that hedging, it actually begins with hedging, right? Rather than like big powers action reactions. And that clearly is a big power centric perspective. Let me respond by sharing not necessarily the small state perspective. So from smaller countries' perspective, um, we are actually responding. As a smaller country, weaker actors, you can't really initiate a lot of things that are impactful or people even sometimes care about, right? Blinken have some other priority in Middle East, he just cancel, right? Or using a reason, technical click or whatever. Smaller states will feel offended, but what can we do, right? So this is just an example that when big powers sometimes do certain things, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintended, but it does have a top-down implication on us, sometimes harming us, sometimes helping us. A lot of time is a bit of both. Can we do anything? Well, we will try to adjust and sometimes to shape and reshape accordingly. So to answer the question of which actually result in which, I think one kind of a process tracing approach would be, can we perhaps choose a case where original position it's non-hedging, but eventually move to hedging? And what are the reasons that actually have led to this shifting position from non-hedging, clear-cut, non-ambiguous, to something ambiguous that we describe as hedging? Since this forum is held in Malaysia, I mean, at least the secretariat, let's use Malaysia as an example. And I think it's a perfect example that actually for the first 14 years of our statehood, we're a young country, right? We got independent in 1957. The first 14 years of Malaysia's statehood, from 1957 to 1971, we were not hedging at all. We took side, right? We sided with the UK directly, and then the West, meaning US led free world indirectly. We took sides completely, meaning that we collaborated, we supported with the West, and we countered communist powers, including or primarily China. So when India and China had the border war in 1962, we actually went all out to support India. We have the safe democracy fund and all that, and we condemn China. We also condemn China on Tibetan issue and all that. So it was very clear-cut, non-ambiguous at all. But what happened was the turning point that pushed us smaller countries to actually adopt something that eventually led to the current hedging position was what happened in late 1960s and also 1970s, when started from a British East or West policy, when for domestic reason, United Kingdom had to retreat strategically from Southeast Asia, and we were the victim, right? Although AMDA, our alliance with the UK, actually helped us to handle confrontation, but when UK had to go leave us and downgrade basically the AMDA Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement to FPDA, which is a consultative mechanism and not alliance, we just have to accept that because of this is top down, right? We cannot like beg London, please do consider, right? We cannot do that. And coincidentally, UK's British East or West policy coincided with US Nixon doctrine. Because of the setback in Vietnam, US also withdraw from mainland Southeast Asia. So these are all big structural top-down events that took place in late 1960s and have a big impact on smaller countries in the sense that we have been counting on the West directly, completely for so long. But of course, when they have to go or reduce the strategic commitment, we cannot stop them, but we will have to face the consequences. So we realized that we had to face with the communist threat power on our own. And hence some adjustment, a lot of adjustment from then on, right? We began to embrace a non-alignment. We began to focus more on regionalism. We also began to focus on diplomatic efforts with China, with many other socialist countries from then on that continue until today. So in short, it is the big power action that create the strategic structural uncertainties that push smaller countries to hedge in one way or another. So in a plain language, hedging simply means insurance policy. Why we bought insurance policy, and we do not bought just one, right? We bought a number, multiple layer of insurance, because why? You have different risks. Some risks have to do with big power A, some have to do with big power B, some is the interaction between them. Can we control? We cannot control. Do we have to face the consequences? Yes, we have to face the consequences. Do you know when and how would that be? We do not know. But we know that as human nature, our instinctive stance is that we know there are some risks out there, and we are seeing the risks are growing, and you just need to hedge by using and developing a lot of mechanisms. Some are strategic mechanisms, some economic, some diplomatic, bilateral, multilateral, because of, as a smaller countries, you know that when certain things happen, we will be the first to suffer, and we'll be the one who suffered the most. And China's action recently flying 16 aircraft. I hate to use this, but it's something that I think many Malaysians still find it unbelievable, right? It's just a reminder to tell us that, look, big power action and interaction are just uncertain, right? You thought the situation is A, but things might move on in another case. So strategic uncertainty certainly is the main cause. We are all students of IR, and then we talk about IVDV, independent variable. I think strategic uncertainties at the structural level is the main factor, is a main independent variable that explains why smaller countries, regardless of our differences in political systems, have chosen to hedge in one way or another. There are differences across this hedging behavior. Some are hedging much heavier than others. Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore certainly have hedged much heavier than, say, Malaysia, than Thailand, and also the mainland Southeast Asian countries, except Vietnam. Vietnam also a heavy hedger. And the reasons being the intervening variable, meaning the domestic variables, the domestic politics. So we try to play down a certain aspect, we try to play up a certain aspect, depending on what is the domestic reasons. I hope I address what Dr. Hu requested me to respond, and I hope, Andrew, I did not disappoint you by offering a small state perspective.
No, can I comment, and then I have one follow-up question for Dr. Quick. So I have to absolutely agree with you there. If there's instability, it's always the fault of great powers, right? Because they dominate, and you're absolutely correct, because as we've noted, hedging is a reaction to the uncertainty created by great powers, or it's a reaction to shifting balances of power. So in that sense, yes, if you're going to find a beginning of a causal argument, a chain for instability, begin with the great powers. I don't think that, I mean, I would argue that hedging then contributes to, it can lead, it doesn't necessarily have to, but it can contribute to further instability. So I should make a qualification there. I do think that Chu Ping had asked a question about hedging with other, I mean, hedging when it involves other countries, because for now we've been talking in a world of only two great powers and then smaller powers. But of course, you've argued, Cheng Cui, that of course you can hedge by joining multilateral institutions. You can hedge by aligning with other states beyond two great powers. And I think there was a question in the chat box or the Q&A that asked the question as such. So of course, there's also that option too, where I think with South Korea's example in the New Southern Policy, I mean, one of the specific rationales for putting more emphasis on Southeast Asia and India in this New Southern Policy was to diversify risks. After China punished South Korea for having the US deploy THAAD missiles, and South Korea woke up and they said, well, look, we have a lot of our factories, a lot of our investments are in China, and if China is going to boycott South Korean companies, then we're going to have to find other places for production. And so, so that would be an example of diversifying risk. I never really, in my own, I guess, understanding, I didn't really think of that as hedging, but you could see it as a form of hedging, so that could be another strategy. My question for Cheng Tui is about, it goes back to the counter hedging, and if you think the United States and China counter hedge in different ways, because I wasn't aware about the aircraft or the ships or the show of force for Malaysia, excuse me, to pressure them. I am aware about the Philippines. You know, there was about 280 vessels that were in the South China Sea, or what they like to call it here, the West Philippine Sea. And every day the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs was issuing a complaint or a summons. And eventually most of the ships went away. But the United States, they like to show their ships and like their blue water navy and their aircraft carriers when they're upset with an adversary. But they don't usually do that they don't use a show of force for their own allies and partners. Usually it's more of a diplomatic reprimand, or it's more through words and diplomacy. Whereas China is using economic levers and more coercive strategies. So I wanted to ask you if you see a difference in the way the two big powers use counter hedging strategies.
Very good question. I'm not quite sure whether I have an answer, but I certainly agree with you that US and China as big powers, competing powers, they pursue their strategic ends differently. So in this case, when they want to stop smaller countries from hedging, right, they do it differently. And that's my interpretation. And let me acknowledge that it's just my personal view, and experts on China, like for example, Dr. Niao will have a better interpretation. Yeah, sorry, Dr. Niao, I have to entrap you. You are our leading expert on China. So from my understanding and interpretation about China's way of, that's the word that you use, right, Andrew, show of force. Like sending 284 ships in the Philippines water, and then 16 jets in Malaysia. And this is not the first, this will not be the last, right? Similar pattern will agree. My little interpretation is China's way of exercising Sun Tzu strategy. There is one phrase in Chinese, it is stated as 屈人, I think that's what is the exact phrase. 无用武, yeah, you actually
不战而屈人之兵, I think was.
不战而屈人之兵, exactly. So 不战而屈人之兵, right? So you actually use some military force elements, but without really going to war, but still attaining the political purpose of let the target, in this case, smaller countries, to do what you want them to do, right? Meaning that your will prevail by using some force, but not directly, not invoking war, right? And from Chinese perspective, and that's my interpretation, that's exactly a very benign way, right? Meaning I want you to get the message, I don't like this, I have my red line position and all that, but without actually hurting you, right? And at the same time, I use diplomacy, I use development to tell you that collaborating with me, if not siding with me completely, you can get a little benefits. I think that's what China's way of pursuing that political ends. Of course, I think they underestimate as smaller countries, it is in our DNA that yes, development is important, economic benefit is important, but autonomy, right? Sovereignty and territorial integrity is also important. Sometimes I think China overbelieve that the power of economic statecraft. They think that as long as smaller countries can benefit from economic and also other diplomatic support when you need it, when you're being pressured by United States on political ground, I can help you. I think those are important, but again, smaller countries still have to face our own domestic constituency, right? And China perhaps do not know, they do not care. And this is something I think part of big power DNA. I think US have the same tendency as well. I think it's on the opposite side, right? US think that thinking that security and autonomy it's what demanded by smaller countries. So they keep supplying that from up and also through Indo-Pacific, through Quad and all that. I think to some extent we actually welcome that, right? Even though we might not say it openly, because it helps us to constrain China. But our bottom line is we do not want constrainment to become a containment, because when that happens, it hurt all of us. And again, we will be the first to suffer. And also US overbelieve the importance of security at the expense of overlooking some diplomatic interaction engagement. It's what smaller countries want. When we also want development and all that, and US, it's overlooking and neglecting this issue, right? Why Belt and Road has been expanding, despite all the controversies and also shortcomings and also problems, mainly because of China's True Belt and Road and other statecraft provide what we want. So in short, I know, sorry, this is a very long elaborated answer. In short, I do think that smaller countries want three things: prosperity, development, security, and then political autonomy. But we know big powers are all part of the solutions, but also part of problems. And because of things are not straightforward, we just have to hedge in one way or another by purchasing and subscribing to different layer of insurance policy, hoping that when certain things happen, you'll help us in one way or another. And then Andrew, I like your example of a New Southern policy. It's it's also a layer of hedging protection that South Korea hope to get from Southeast Asia, and then through diversifying purposes and all that. Sorry, Dr. Niao, I'm pretty sure you have a better interpretation on China's use of force. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Cheng Chui. So it's a good time to wrap Chao Bing into the conversation. So especially on China, I really like it when Andrew packaged it in the way that actually back in the mind subconsciously for South Korea, China is indeed a very important actor for long-term, for inter-Korean relations, and because they are just next to each other. So by having South Korea considering their interests and also many others' interests, including US as their allies' interests and whatnot. So Chao Bing, in your understanding about China, so just like what Cheng Chui has mentioned just now, China being overconfident in their economic statecraft, so the economic retaliation on South Korea, especially I think there are some questions also asking about the recent jet fighter intruding into Malaysia airspace. So how does this serve China in the long run, and China's counter hedging itself? Do they try to force the smaller states into not hedging at all and trying to coerce them to be on their side? So your view, please.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you here for this very enlightening presentation and the discussion. I've enjoyed every part of it. I think there are a lot of Q&A coming up, so I will be very brief. Thank you for saying that I'm a China expert or whatever, but I'm ashamed to say so. I think China is more and more difficult to read, even for me. More and more difficult to understand. However, I wouldn't say that I have a definite answer. My interactions with the Chinese scholarly community, those who look into hedging and so on and so forth, and yes, I can detect some of them are okay. Just like no big powers do not like hedging. They think that this is very a very suspect behavior. But I do think some actually understand. Some would say that this is understandable, and they will make a point that as long as it doesn't really hurt Chinese interests directly, it is okay, it's fine. And then I just kind of want to develop that thought a little bit in the sense that counter-hedging behavior could be another under conceptualized or under theorized behavior or concept in which we all thought that the counter hedging behavior would be the same, no pushing or no pressuring, whatever. But sometimes it may not be the way that we think. What we think would be, the classic example of counter hedging behavior may not necessarily be the same. For my understanding, sometimes the Chinese will interpret their actions as directly reacting to certain threats to China's national interest. That issue is a classic example where on the one side is saying that this is counter hedging, this is forcing us because of the US-China alliance. The Chinese interpretation, consistently say that no, we have nothing against, but South Korea hedging, but now you are actually directly threatening the direct interest for China national security. I think some Chinese scholars, they do want to make that point, and then they say that, just like in the South China Sea, and they will point out that, remember, South China Sea is a disputed area. China claims their own interests, their own sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So when they feel that some of their interests, their claims are being under threat, and they will react, and we will interpret that reactions as some kind of a counter hedging, but in their way of understanding that this may not be. We are fine with new counter hedging in other parts, but when you have certain actions that we perceive that as directly threatening our own interests, therefore we will react. We being China in this case. So I think there is one possible interpretation of some of the Chinese actions recently. Just like the big powers are always not being sensitive enough to what smaller countries think. Sometimes smaller countries may be oversensitive of what the big countries do. I think, what is the name? Brandy Womack has a classic book on this one, China-Vietnam relations. One is being very unsensitive, the other one being oversensitive. And they contribute to a lot of misunderstanding and build on, and then to the point that the mutual relationship has deteriorated very much. I think that is something that we have to be aware also. So that would be my little intervention and contribution here. Perhaps a new research project on counter hedging led by our master of hedging and others as well. All right, so I will stop here. I think many questions. Chu Ping will have a very hard job for moderating the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we have here from all of our experts sitting on this panel. So the first question that I would like to ask Andrew is from Professor Brian Bridges. So he enjoyed your talk very much. And you mentioned that South Korea should pool risks with the like-minded states. So Japan clearly is not small power and is also a vital US ally, which is suspicious of China. So I think suspicions over China is also the keyword here. So in regards to Korea-Japan relations, they have been in a very poor condition. So is it feasible to see Moon Jae-in or his potential successors slowly moving to work better with Japan or trilaterally with the US for the foreseeable future?
Thank you for the question. And just to reiterate again, by small powers, certainly Japan is a major power. Some will refer to as a middle power. So it's not small power in the traditional sense, but other than it's not a US or China, that's what I meant. But it's a very good question. Korea-Japan relations are still in poor shape. One thing that's been encouraging from at least the US perspective, maybe not so much from China, is that there has been a lot of effort since Biden has come into office to improve trilateral relations, or at least there's been several dialogues among, at the working level, among deputies, among, I guess, the Joint Chief of Staff. So the militaries have gotten together to meet, the national security advisors have gotten to meet together. So there's been a lot of, at least, discussions. And my guess is most of it revolves around North Korea policy and other security-related issues, but mainly North Korea policy. And even the Moon government has said that it can work with Japan on North Korea issues. Likewise, Japan, in their joint statement, said working with Korea on issues of the Korean Peninsula. So that's all welcome, and I think that coordination on that front, on U.S.-Japan trilateral relations, can improve. But the question is, can they cooperate on things like questions related to the Indo-Pacific or on China policy? And I think that's going to be more difficult. So, and that may, even if so there's the whole historical antagonism component. Even if that gets resolved, would that encourage Korea to join the U.S.-Japan in pressing China further? And that's not a question that can be easily answered. Intuitively, you would think yes, because relations are on the mend, but not necessarily. So that is always a limitation. But I do see things moving upward, and with the next elections coming up next year, I mean, it's usually easier when a conservative is in government to work with Japan, but it's too early to tell right now where things stand domestically in South Korea.
Thanks so much for that. So the next question is from about the tension between China and US over the Taiwan issue, so which might envelop into a military conflict. So he wished to know whether you see the potential of South Korea going to involve itself in any way about the Taiwan Straits conflict.
This was one of the points in the joint statement that I was most surprised about, to see Taiwan in there, because for years, South Korea has refused to take a clear stand on the Taiwan Straits conflict. I remember in 2006, there was a policy known as strategic flexibility that the US wanted to be able to use US forces Korea, so US troops in Korea, for contingencies outside of the Korean Peninsula. And eventually, I think that was agreed upon, but South Korea made very clear saying that, okay, fine, you can have strategic flexibility, but it requires approval from the South Korean National Assembly. So South Korea will always have a say on how US forces can be used outside of the Korean Peninsula. And although they didn't say it, everyone knew that it was the Taiwan Straits conflict that they were most conflicted about. So I heard from some South Korean colleagues that the reason why it's included in a joint statement is the Moon government may have been thinking strategically, if we kind of put in the things that the Biden administration wants to hear, maybe they'll give us more flexibility on North Korea. So of course, the Taiwan statement was very ambiguous, and when the South Korean spokesperson, I don't know, when they were answering questions, someone asked about Taiwan for more details, and they said their response was, "Oh, this is a very general statement." So in principle, they're saying they support, Taiwan's, they support in principle in the region, stability and security, but they kind of vacillated or waffled on any more clarity on how they would actually approach Taiwan. And I think that's the best that we're going to get from South Korea. I still believe, even though it's in the joint statement, that they don't want to take a clear stand. But at least for the United States, they have in writing that South Korea had mentioned Taiwan. So maybe that was a good enough, and it was a win for everyone, except for China, of course.
Thanks so much for that response. So next, coming from Sarang K, which sounds like Sarang He. I'm not sure whose nickname is this. So he wants to, so this person wants to ask about whether you see the potential of South Korea pooling risk with the ASEAN countries, like minimizing the punitive risk from both US and China. And is there any other imperative way that for South Korea to reduce the escalating great power competition by creating a sort of a middleway coalition like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and maybe we would think about Australia and others. So what is your thoughts about this?
Sure. Sarang K, that's the only Sarang K I know is an actress and a Miss Korea winner, Kim Sarang. So I'm not sure if we have a secret celebrity on the call, but on the question about pooling risks together with other countries, I I mean, I alluded to this earlier in my comments about the New Southern Policy, and that was precisely one of the reasons why South Korea decided to invest more resources diplomatically, economically in Southeast Asia and also India. And that's a very smart, it's a very wise strategy. South Korea also says too that they've for a long time just focused on its surrounding powers, Northeast Asia or big powers, so Japan, China, in terms of diplomacy, Japan, China, United States, and Russia. But now they are trying to diversify. And this is certainly a win for, I think, the Moon government, and it was a very prescient move. What does that translate to? So yes, ASEAN, but at least economically, most of the economic relations with Southeast Asia are with Vietnam. But I think there's South Korea is trying to make more headway, more investments. They're looking for more partnerships. There's development projects going on in in many of the Southeast Asian countries. I was surprised to know that in Philippines, there's a dam that's being built by South Koreans. I had assumed that most of the dams being built are Chinese or Chinese or Japanese financed, but there's a Korean one here as well too. So yes, these are all. This is a way to help minimize some of the risk. It's good for South Korea because it also helps expand South Korea's profile. But when you mention countries like Australia or even Japan, that's a little bit different because ASEAN has always been seen as more neutral. They're the masters of hedging, I suppose. Whereas clearly now, because of the Quad, Japan and Australia are tightly linked to the United States. So in my lecture and my remarks, I did say that South Korea should pool together with other like-minded countries. And when I said like-minded, I exactly meant Australia and Japan. But this is up for debate. Is that something that is good for South Korean national interest? I would say yes. But if you see that as, the reason why South Korea may be resisting a bit or has been resisting is because it may again be seen as trying to contain China, trying to form an anti-China coalition or balancing against China. And so it's, honestly, there isn't a right or wrong perspective. As scholars, we can say there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's, what's your best argument that you can make and where's your evidence? We can say that, but for policymakers, it's not about what the best evidence or argument is. These are choices that will have real world consequences, whether in terms of, economics, in terms of business investments, or, in more serious cases, in terms of conflict. So these are difficult choices, but you can see that there's an argument for both sides. And for a while, the side that's been winning is the one that sees, rocking the boat on China, looking like you're containing China is going to punish South Korean interests, but that position may be changing. And it's not just about what South Korea does. They're going to observe what China does as well too. If China takes actions that look like it's more, if anything that relates to maritime access, for instance, if it looks like South Korea's maritime access is going to be disrupted by China, then yes, South Korea in a hurry is going to form a stronger partnership with Australia and Japan and the United States. So yes, it's something that we have to continue and observe.
So we will get to that maritime bit a bit later. So I would like to highlight one of our postgrad students' questions, which is tied out to this previous question about, Ahmad Zikri asked about why US doesn't see South Korea's closer relations with China as an opportunity for the US to engage China. And maybe that is also the way the South Korea channel to induce China to become a more responsible power to be cooperated with. So your thoughts on that?
Right. So thank you for that question. That's an excellent question as well. I have argued in other spaces. So Chu Ping will know this. In this KEI paper that I presented a few weeks ago, Korean Economic Institute, I wrote about regional architecture and the US South Korea alliance. And one of the points I made, I said that South Korea should try to play more of a bridging role between the United States and China. And South Koreans have tried to play that role at times. Back in 2013, when, if you remember, China was just getting the AIIB, the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank started. It was getting that established. And the United States, the Obama administration, was pressing countries or its allies to not join this bank, including South Korea. There was, I don't know if it was pressure, but they made it clear that they didn't want other countries to join this multilateral lending bank. But South Korea joined, and their argument or rationale was, look, there aren't very many Asian allies or countries that are a part of the AIIB, but we can help keep you informed about what's going on with AIIB discussions. And one of the concerns is that the AIIB may not play by the same international standards and rules as other multilateral lending banks, that it won't adhere to the same international standards. But South Korea, being a member of the other lending banks, can say that we can make sure that whatever rules are devised with this new bank, that they follow international standards. So that's a way where where South Korea can play more of a constructive role between US-China relations. So I actually welcome the idea. I know in my talk, it sounded very much, I think because we're talking about hedging, it's easy to get caught up in this black or white dichotomy where you choose either between China or the United States, that the choices have to be binary. But if we go back to this idea of hedging, there are actually many options, but there's also this option to try to bridge differences. I think the problem now is that structurally, we all know that US-China relations have really deteriorated, and in the US, I think the narrative, the language, how China is being discussed, it's so negative that if South Korea were to proposition the United States or Washington and say, look, we can try to convince you that what China is doing with development in Malaysia or in the Philippines is actually quite positive and constructive, I'm not really sure how Washington would react. But I do think there may be room for it. So in certain areas like development aid or infrastructure, I've argued that there's a lot of infrastructure need within this region. And there's no way that any one country can take care of all of it. China with its BRI, it's large, it's big, but even China alone cannot do it. And there might be ways to actually coordinate. So Japan's approach has been, I actually think they've been more open to working with, they're not a member of AIIB, but ADB and AIB have some initiatives, and they're open to some of the projects with BRI. And, of course, you have to look at the terms of the loans and the finance, but there might be ways to coordinate between China and some of the development initiatives that the US and maybe Japan and Australia are putting together. It may seem far-fetched now, but hopefully if cooler heads prevail, they might be able to find ways of working together constructively. And South Korea could certainly help play that bridging role. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
For that response. So I would like to combine two more questions into one. So Hafiza Hassan and also Nazifa Jusso is interested about the potential for countries like South Korea and other smaller countries to practice strategic hedging. So where they don't have to choose between China and the US, but engaging actively with other middle powers. So taking, for example, US policy under the Trump administration has been making their allies feeling insecure. So which erode the confidence of US allies in trusting US to secure their allies' security interests. So what is your view about this?
Yeah, so under the Trump administration, things were a little different. Because he rejected multilateralism, But I think under Biden, who's been much more welcoming of alliances and multilateral initiatives, I think this is a way, it is a way for countries to get some assurances from the United States. You can partner with the US and align with the US, but not have the fear that, okay, well, we've aligned with the US and they're just going to leave us stranded. I think the current administration is much more sensitive to things like commitments to institutions including alliances and institutions including multilateral institutions. Of course, that ASEAN fiasco where the Secretary of State missed, Anthony Blinken, I don't know what happened with that. So that is actually not a good start, or it's not good form. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. But certainly I think the US can send out signals where allies and partners align with the US that there are certain benefits, that you aren't going to be left high and dry. And under the Trump administration, there was certainly more uncertainty with that because of the statements and the rhetoric that Trump would make.
Thank you so much. And so the next series of questions would be dealing with the smaller states that doesn't explicitly highlighted South Korea's role. So many of the from the audience are curious about how are we going to deal with bigger powers in the region. And many of them have cited the example about some of the Southeast Asian countries have to purchase littoral mission ship, LCS, from China. And at the same time, our maritime capability is actually pretty underwhelming to deal with the pressure from China and all that. So given how the previous discussion about China sending a jet fighter from time to time into our airspace, so do you see hedging as a alignment choice to protect security interests? And also, is it possible that China would not compromise on its sovereignty and exercise its exclusive authority over Taiwan, may implicate how the other countries may want to hedge, fudge, or balance and otherwise with China?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure. So what is, the first part was about basing, and then the second part was more about hedging. So I'm not sure if I followed quite exactly what the question was, but maybe I can look for it in the Q&A box. Can you let me know whose question that was?
Yeah, so I actually tried to combine several of those.
Okay.
There are quite plenty. So I think, for instance, the HC Lee, so who asked about big powers expect their smaller neighbors and client state to hedge. So fudge is the term that they
okay. Oh, so, I have this big project right now on comparative basing strategy, which is completely different from, this project. And so this is really a question that I'd love to answer here. But when it comes to basing, when you put a military base, that's actually signaling something, that it's no longer economics, but you're making a security commitment to a country. And so I think the question here is about whether that ends sort of hedging, or are these exceptions to hedging by smaller states? But even with military base, even when you have that form of commitment, you can still hedge, because in this discussion that we have on comparative basing, there's a concern that what happens if countries begin to play off the great powers by inviting bases from multiple powers? So in Russia and Central Asia, you have US bases, and you had US bases and Russian bases in Kyrgyzstan. Or Djibouti in the Horn of Africa is the best example. They have Japanese bases, Chinese bases, US bases, I think a Turkish base. There are like 4 or 5 countries with a base. So a good example would be Singapore. What happens if down the road, the Chinese also want to use a port in Singapore? They want to build a base. And because for some of these host countries, smaller countries, it's not really about, are we committed to China or the US? It's about how much money are you willing to pay to give you access rights. So in that example, even with bases, you can still continue hedging behavior. You could just do it over bases. Now that would anger, I think from the US perspective, I think that would make the United States very, very upset if one of our partners also gave access to a base to the Chinese. But that is a reality in the future as China is going to be looking to protect its maritime interests. And so it wouldn't be unsurprising to see more ports being used for dual use purpose. But if the US also needs access as well too, there's no reason why Malaysia can't say, oh, well, if you give us $75 million a year, we can give you access to this port. Maybe they won't put the Chinese and the US on the same port, but yes, hedging can continue even with military bases. And what was the other question then that you had combined, or did I answer?
So I think I would better follow up with a more relevant question for you, which is about the Philippines. I really like your work on the US bases as well, so we'd like to hear your thoughts about this. So the Philippines has been able to reap benefits from both US and China, especially when Duterte's administration is moving closer to China. So will South Korea be able or not be able to do the same?
They could do the same, but it would really require a very outspoken, almost a Trump-like president to come in power to do it, because the United States has different expectations for the Philippines as they do with South Korea. The Philippines no longer has permanent US bases or troops. I think it would be much harder for South Korea and realistically, to pull that off. That doesn't mean that they can't get benefits from China and the United States simultaneously, but to do it in the way that Duterte has done it, I think would be very difficult. And I might just add, it really is Duterte himself. The military, the foreign policy establishment, there's actually a lot of concerns about China. And even with economic investments, a lot of it's been souring. I'm working on a paper actually about Chinese influence in the Philippines. And even though Duterte has gotten some investments from China, the attitude or the mood it was sour. It's like 80% of Filipinos don't trust, or maybe it's not that. It's like 60% of Filipinos Filipinos don't trust China. So they're still very pro-US, but it's Duterte himself, I think, that has gone on a limb to curry favor with China. And it's Duterte personally. He personally does not like the United States. That's what it boils down to.
Very interesting. So the next one is from Professor Yoshihide Soeya. So thank you, Professor, for joining our forum. So he would like to ask about Quad. So in the Quad statement, it says that they will support ASEAN centrality, ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. So how do you interpret what this means? And if there's any substance to it or just more rhetoric? And would this not just imply something for South Korea to rethink how to engage Quad?
Thank you, Professor Soeya, for your question. I'm sorry I can't see you, but it's good to at least know that I'm interacting with you in this virtual space. I think the last time we saw each other was in DC. But I've recently read some pieces that talked about, let's be realistic, when they talk about catering to ASEAN centrality and taking into account ASEAN, that it's all rhetoric, that you just have to say these things because it's part of the region. So they're looking at ASEAN centrality very skeptically. They just put it in because it's something that you have to say because there are all these other ASEAN-led forums. But I actually do think that there is substance to it, because I think even American policymakers recognize that the way diplomacy is done in Asia is different, I think, from the West, and that there is some use in the language and rhetoric of ASEAN. And even if you can't, so I'm thinking about the South China Sea issue, for instance. So ASEAN, it's clear that they haven't been able to come up with a clear code of conduct, but I think having that language or having that rhetoric works to the advantage of the US, because it's always talking about peace, stability, inclusiveness. Maybe the inclusiveness they're not really following, but it's certainly they want to talk about informality. They want to talk about respecting sovereignty. So to the extent that they feel that China is not adhering to those principles, they can always, for lack of a better term, weaponize the rhetoric of ASEAN to rally other countries and beat China on the head with. So there are useful ways, there's a way to make use of the ASEAN language and rhetoric. So I don't know if that's maybe a cynical way of including or making use of ASEAN centrality. That's certainly not what maybe ASEAN countries are looking at. But for those reasons, I think in Quad statements, they'll continue to mention ASEAN centrality. That being said, one of the tensions though is that if the Quad becomes more and more serious, if it becomes, it's an informal organization institution, I don't think it's going to be a formal alliance because the US also prefers keeping it informal. But let's say that becomes more of a centerpiece and the Quad Plus becomes larger. What does that then mean for ASEAN and the regional architecture and the ASEAN institutions like the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN +3? There you may see some tensions, but that's something that I feel that ASEAN and the US and other Quad countries can work out. So for now, I do think that these statements talking about ASEAN centrality is still important.
Thank you so much. And the next question comes from Nur Hafiza Halim. So it's about hedging. So do you think that hedging will still be the way of how small states securitize their security and avoid polarization in the future? And would this behavior or action change as challenges and world issues evolve? So perhaps after Andrew Yeo, we would like to have Cheng Chui to respond on this as well.
So is the question about so repeat that one more time for me, or can you show me the question or the?
Oh yeah,
whose
sure.
Whose question was that?
Nur Hafiza Halim.
Okay. I remember that. I see. So yes, I mean, as we were saying, hedging is almost a natural reaction for states. So I was saying that as rivalry intensifies, as tensions increase, the space for hedging becomes more difficult. And so that's what I think where you begin to see polarization. But you know what, there's an assumption though that you're going to continue seeing a heated rivalry. There's some that argue that maybe under Biden and there's some talk about trade or a new trade negotiation or deal going on. If maybe if the bottom levels off and the two sides can come to some sort of healthy understanding, then that space may, the narrowing may begin to widen again. And so then the default will be for states to hedge. So in terms of the future, yes, if there's intensifying rivalry, we may see more polarization. But if things improve, or if at least if they don't get any worse, I would expect hedging to continue, because like myself and Cheng Chui have argued, this is in some ways a natural response for small and secondary states.
Thank you. So I think Hafiza raised a very good question about the regional polarization. And this is actually like often overlooked, but I do think that virtually all ASEAN countries, and in fact more, are worried about the risk of polarization. And in fact, we are seeing already with all the counter hedging that we mentioned, we are actually seeing the growing risk or possibility of polarization, in the sense that the way, for example, that say more and more institutionalization of Quad, and with the likelihood of Quad becoming it was already being perceived as an anti-China bloc. But now with what has been going on, I think you are seeing even more, and more importantly, also with more members, right? The possibility of a Quad Plus again added to that direction. And then, as I mentioned about the counter hedging, I have one more example that I forgot to mention early on, which I think actually prove about the notion of counter hedging, right? New Zealand, yeah. New Zealand case is, I thought, is very, very interesting. It is one of the countries, 3 countries, right? Andrew, please correct me if I'm wrong. New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam.
Yes.
Virtual meeting last year at the height of COVID. And then after that meeting, March, April 2020, many medias, not governments, right? Media began to report about Quad Plus, but I don't think any of these 3 governments actually acknowledge, and which shows that they want to keep distance from this so-called Quad Plus. One of the main reasons is to reduce the risk of polarization, because if you are building more along that line, you are going to actually polarize the situation of China versus the other countries that are determined to push China into a corner. I like the notion of like-minded that you mentioned, Andrew, early on. And as a smaller country, let me try to unpack this as how we see what do we mean by like-minded countries, because it's mentioned almost everywhere. And I think there are 3 elements that are becoming the contents of like-minded. Smaller countries are comfortable with the first and second one, but not comfortable with the third one. And the first is democratic. Yeah, like-minded chances are democratic, liberal democratic countries. We acknowledge that that is a part of the reality, and it's natural for democratic countries to come together for whatever reasons. That's number one. Second element of like-minded notions is you have strategic concerns or some concerns about China, right? So you're worried about China, whether for strategic, military, or political reasons or other reasons. That's the second element. Again, I think smaller countries accept that fact. In fact, we are also concerned about China in one way or another. But the third one, it's something that I think we are getting more uncomfortable. That is, like-minded countries also refer to those who are ready to call out and call out on China, saying that what you are doing is wrong. The former U.S. Secretary, when towards the end of the term, Trump administration, keep going to ASEAN capital, putting pressure on ASEAN countries to actually make a lot of things explicit, right? You need to make statements to put China into their place. And this is something that I think ASEAN countries are not comfortable, because we think as Asians, you do not want to cause another country to lose their face. And sometimes microphone diplomacy will not help. It would actually make things worse. And to some extent, at some point, New Zealand actually took that situation of, well, it's one of the Five Eyes coalition, but at some point, New Zealand make it a point that on certain issues, they do not want to go exactly what other fellow ASEAN Five Eyes members are doing, right? But you see, there were pressure. And more recently, I think it was just 1 or 2 weeks ago, they were pressure portraying New Zealand, even the name, right? Not New Zealand, but New Zealand, right? Meaning sea, meaning that implying without using the word hedging, but implying New Zealand's position is you are doing too soft to China, because of, even though you're a democratic country, you're concerned about China, but you did not do what we are doing, which is that explicitly, openly holding and then calling on China. And I don't think this is something that ASEAN countries want to do, because, as I said, by doing that, you are actually deepening regional polarization of like Cold War situation, right? Bipolar, China versus those who are anti or want to push back at China. And by doing that, you are simply pushing China into a corner. Again, I do not think smaller countries in the region want to do that. And for those of us who study about the history, and then we knew China actually describing some of these activities, converging activities by Quad, US, and also some European powers as a new version of, they call it like the eight countries United Alliance versus China that happened in 1900, right? For Yihe Tuan, which I think it's terrible in the sense that it will only harden the hardliners in China, would make China even more kind of aggressive because of they think that they are being encircled, they are being targeted again by those who do not want to see China rise. And I think ASEAN countries understand that. We try to maintain some ambiguity for that particular reason. So in short, ambiguity can be a necessity. It might not necessarily create insecurity or instability because of it provides some room for countries to maneuver depending on what is the situation, right? I think I will stop here.
Okay, so the rest of the questions are basically about smaller states, Malaysia, Southeast Asia consequences. So I would like to have like the type of a round table in this last 15 minutes among ourselves. And I also would like to invite Dr. Andrea Passeri, who is also one of the scholars working on hedging, and his country specific specialty is on Myanmar. So let's welcome also Dr. Andrea. You may turn on your voice if you can't turn on your camera. So many of the rest of the questions basically deal with the discussion about the view that US is on the decline and China may not pose threat to South Korea, but they do or do not pose a real or perceived threat to the Southeast Asian countries. So there is many ideas about how we should respond to that. So including South Korea. So we know that for a long time, like Andrew has mentioned about the shrink among the whales. If South Korea is shrimp, we might be some microorganism in the ocean. I'm not too sure. So with that, I would like to kick off the discussion about China. So we would often like to say they are the biggest elephant in the room and whatnot. So so will China's foreseeable behavior, especially under the leadership of Xi Jinping, make countries like South Korea, Malaysia, Myanmar, and other countries difficult in the coming years? So any one of you would like to get started about this? May I invite Chao Bing first, maybe?
All right, yeah. Thank you for your questions. As I say, China is more and more difficult to read, and because of the intensifying geopolitical tensions, which everybody, of course, is aware of, I think there is a danger sometimes for us to overread or overinterpret some of the things. And when we overread or overinterpret and act based on those, then China will react to those actions, and it will become actually what we call, yeah, that is exactly what we have something in mind. And what exactly is a self-fulfilling prophecy? I think we're actually in a situation where self-fulfilling prophecy has become more and more possible, prominent, and is getting a lot more with, and it will create the kind of reactions where China would point a finger and say, this is how your side we're going to treat us, and it's not going to go anywhere. I'm not sure I'm giving a correct answer to all these very complex questions, but the simple answer is that because of the lack of trust across many areas, many actions are now being viewed at the worst case possible situation. And it's very difficult to build the kind of communication, the kind of engagement that we used to have before that could actually elevate some tensions. That's how I see the things at the moment. And I wouldn't say that the responsibility squarely on any party. I think all parties have their own share of responsibilities that contribute to this particular situation. Many people would like to point a finger at Xi Jinping, and definitely I think he is the kind of leader that China did not have before. But what do we do? He's there, and he's going to be there for a while, and he is a tough leader, definitely. But we also have some other leaders who also perhaps exploited the situation for their own benefits, for leveraging the situation in order to increase the so-called confrontational approach or whatever. So I think that is unfortunately the situation that we are in at the moment. And hedging, of course, I think one thing I do agree, or I mean, I've listened to this discussion attentively, and hedging become more and more, I think, hedging or counter hedging become more and more feel like a risk, a behavior that is becoming more and more untenable in a way. I'm not sure whether Ching-Chi will agree with me, but that is exactly what I say just now. We now approach many of the actions and reactions in terms that are very hedging, counter hedging, calculating, balance, or whatever it is, that in a way over securitize the whole way of looking into the foreign policy landscape and concepts. So I think that is and that is the situation now. I don't really have a very good answer to all these the emerging issues at the moment.
Okay, so I think next we will have Cheng-Chi to say a few words and followed by Andrew to wrap up the whole discussion.
Sure, let me do it quickly. I agree with Chao Bing's points about action reactions, about the self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, I also agree with your description of the fact, the reality that hedging is becoming more untenable. And in fact, that is being captured in the very first point that I highlighted, that I acknowledge that hedging is, there are limits. And that's one of the limits is that it's not up to us to decide whether and for how long, in what way we can hedge. But it's we react to the top-down situation. But the top-down situation, it's reducing, narrowing the space in which we can actually hedge. But at the moment, I think everybody is still hedging, and we are hoping that we can still do that for as long as possible. But bearing in mind that it might be a time when the game game over, right? You need to, and sometimes it's not us who make the choice, but you'll be entrapped. But short of that, we try to hedge as much as possible. So in one more point, and then I'll stop, is that so given this reality and also growing pressure, so what I think smaller countries are actually doing, not we should do, but we are actually doing, it's already happening. I use the word multi-layered alignment to describe the current trend, right? And this is an article that I'm working on. I know it sounds a bit ridiculous or counterintuitive. That is, if you want to maintain the position of a non-alignment, you need to pursue multi-layered alignment. And as I said, it's already happening. And there is a distinction between how smaller countries in ASEAN region do multi-layered alignment with the rest of many other countries, including or primarily Quad. I think we are all adding layers, right? Because of their many risks, you need to buy and create more insurance. So you create a bilateral layer, you create a trilateral, minilateral, and multilateral in many directions. But one aspect that the way ASEAN countries are doing this multi-layered alignment that is different from the Quad members, at least for now, is that we make it the point that we also do it with China. So meaning that that's the essence of ASEAN inclusivity, right? We make it a point, send a signal to China that although we are concerned about you, we are getting more uncomfortable, but we do not want to push you as an enemy because of self-fulfilling prophecy. So the recent trend, again, is missing from the literature in IR scholarship is that, in fact, in reality, over the last 1 decade or so, ASEAN countries, Malaysia included, we have been actually developing defense cooperation with China, the very source of our apprehension. Why is that? It's part of the multi-layered alignment so that you hedge in different way and send the right signal. It's not perfect. It might create some speculation, but at least we send a signal to China that we still want to engage with you continuously. And which is why Indonesia, after visiting Luhut and also Retno, I mentioned that they are actually making a point that they are also exercising with China, right? The Air Force between the two countries. But this week, of course, they're doing it. Next week, they're actually doing it with the United States as well. Is this creating speculation? I think yes, but at least we are not pushing China into one corner that might create more hostility. in short, the hedging is not perfect, but it is indispensable. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Cheng Chui. So to wrap up the whole session, so I would like to give some prompt to Andrew. So there is one of the questions just now actually also mentioned about sitting on the fence. So China doesn't like smaller countries to sit on the fence, or in Cheng Chui's words, buying insurances. So what is Americans' view about this, that smaller countries are sitting on the fence, undecided what to do, or actively reaching out with multiple partners to buy all sorts of insurance to secure their interests? So what is your view about this? And also to relate this to the multi-layer cooperation mechanism, to what do you think about the regional architecture in East Asia as a whole?
Thanks. Yeah, this has been a fabulous time of discussion. I'm at 2 hours is quite long, so I think I'm starting to tire out. But in terms of, looking at sitting on the fence, I mean, like I had said before, the United States, will always say that countries are free to choose their own foreign policies. The U.S. likes to say they don't coerce other countries to do certain things. Now, that's a very charitable way of looking at things, because I do think that there's a lot of pressure going on here and there. But in terms of fence sitting, unless there are certain expectations, I think, for its treaty alliance partners relative to other partners. So you have partners like Singapore, or maybe even Thailand or Australia, that in the past, Australia in the past was, in some ways, it was more tilted towards China. But the U.S., they accepted that, but they would also express some displeasure as well too. But I think for some of its core allies these days, Japan, Korea, and now, I mean, Australia is very different from what it was 15 years ago in terms of its foreign policy. I do think policymakers in Washington take it personally if it looks like Japan and Korea are not, if I don't want to use the word deferential, because again, the US doesn't like those terms, but if it's doing things that the US thinks is counter to its own interests, which means doing things that enhance potentially the capabilities of China, then that becomes a problem, I think, for the United States. So fence sitting is fine, but there are different expectations that they have for allies and partners, I think, depending on how close or what the history of a certain relationship has been. But in that case, then I think the US prefers the smaller countries, middle powers, its allies to make a choice and be consistent with it, to work together with the United States in resolving collective action problems within the region. But the world is changing, the region is changing, not just structurally, but in terms of the way the different, as I mentioned before, not only the analytical tool, we have more analytical tools and concepts, but literally there are more institutions, there are more minilaterals, forums where states can come together to try to resolve differences, to try to facilitate cooperation. And the thing that has really bugged me the most in doing this research on regional architecture is, for me, the regional architecture can be a form of stability. Through institutions, you can create more coordination with other countries, that you can enhance, you can address problems of regional governments, and you can enhance cooperation. I mean, that's what we assume regional institutions or international institutions do. But in some ways, it's been hijacked by this competition between US and China, so that even as you work through institutions, it becomes, well, is this an institution that is helping China, or is it an institution that is helping the United States? And I think the real problem here is this zero-sum mentality that the great powers have, I think, right now in dealing with competition. And you know, if I can say that, well, it's because China has turned really assertive and it's the US reacting. That's a very US centric view. And I'm sure if I looked at the situation from Beijing, it would be a very different story. So blame can go all around. But I do hope that that states, at least middle powers, smaller powers, secondary states, at least they have these other regional institutions that they can go to. It's not just about aligning between US and China, but you can have configurations or even partnerships among ASEAN countries, among South Korea and India, or South Korea and Australia. And I do think that creating this network, US Secretary of Defense Ash Carter called it a principled security network. Having this network actually does enmesh countries together. So I think that does help put a check in this polarizing dynamic that we're seeing.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So we can't be happier having this conversation, and I'm sure the panelists and the participants are all enjoying all of this discussion. So now allow me to invite Dr. Niao Chaobing to deliver his closing remarks.
Thank you. I think we can agree that this has been a very productive 2-hour discussion. Presentation by Professor Andrew Yeo, and followed by the discussion by Professor Kwek Ching Chi, and then also a very productive Q&A discussion. So I would like to thank everyone, every participant who has stayed on throughout this webinar. I want to once again thank the Korea Foundation. It is with their support that this webinar become possible. So very grateful. I also would like to thank the partnering institutions, EAIR Caucus and ICMAS of UKM, and my two good friends, Dr. Kwek Ching Chi and Dr. Hu Chiu-ping, and Dr. Hu also for moderating for this 2-hour session. Very difficult job. So thank you for your moderating. So that's all. All the people I want to thank. And finally, I just wish everyone stay safe, healthy throughout during this pandemic, difficult time, and also be well, and then be optimistic that a better time will come in the coming months, hopefully. All right, that's my closing remark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Mhm.
Please take care.